The Guru and the Chela by the Ascended Master Kuthumi. The Bridge to Freedom Journal, May 1956. Note: as this subject is so pertinent at present, I offer my column to this article inspired by my humble self through the Curtis's personality long ago. Excerpts of instruction on the memory of past lives from Voice of Isis by Curtis, written in 1914. The memory of past lives is given not for amusement, nor to satisfy vain curiosity, but to inculcate a needed lesson. The destiny of each soul is ultimately to take its proper place in the divine plan. All follows an exact law. Remembrance only comes when the higher self sees that the personality is ready, when the physical brain has been trained to vibrate to some extent in response to the will of the higher self. Many ask, why is not the memory of past lives more common? There is a deep reason for this. In our evolution, we have passed through many sad and embittering experiences, which, if remembered, would so depress our spirits, so discourage and hamper us that we would make little progress. Also, did we remember who we were and who our present companions were, in many cases we would find it so hard to forgive the injuries, so hard to forget the troubles we had passed through in connection with them, that our spiritual growth would be retarded. Since the law, acting as karma, demands perfect compensation or adjustment, one great object in each new life is to readjust the mistakes of the past. When an opportunity to do so comes to us in this life, if we could remember all that had passed, it would be far harder to love your enemies, do good to them which hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. Hence, it is in love and wisdom that the knowledge of past lives is withheld. Many think that could they remember who they were in the past, it would be all joy and wonder. However, in the majority of cases, it would be a bitter disappointment and a sad, depressing remembering. Therefore, we shall never be permitted to remember our past lives until we have advanced beyond the point where the griefs, the ills, and the unkindnesses done us can affect us, make us worry or become discouraged, and thus retard our progress. We shall not remember until we have gained that poise which nothing can disturb, until we have become centered in the thought that to manifest divine love is all there is worth striving for. Most souls find the memory of the trials and sorrows of one life as much as the personality can bear. Therefore, the complete remembrance of all it had endured in its many lives would tend to crush it. It is memory that haunts, that drives to insanity. No one day can hold enough sorrow to dishearten utterly the personality. It is the accumulated burden that overwhelms. A most important lesson to learn is to put from you all that is past. Live in the present. Let the dead past bury its dead. Until the soul has learned that what is past is registered within the real self as a lesson learned, a needed experience gained, and can let it go, not being crushed by its memory. Until the personality shows its strength of character by not brooding over mistakes, until it has exemplified this stability in its present life, its Heavenly Father, in loving mercy, draws a veil over the memory of previous incarnations. When it can bear without flinching or shrinking the memory of the sorrows of one life, it will be ready to bear a more extended memory. Another reason why we do not remember is that at each incarnation the soul clothes itself in a new body, the brain cells of which have never responded to the past conditions, and only when the brain is capable of responding to the memory stored up in the higher self can that memory be impressed upon the waking consciousness. In other words, the personality per se cannot remember the past because it has experienced but the present life. Another reason is that many of our lives have been so commonplace or trivial that they have registered little of value in the real self, hence have little of importance to remember. For out of each life, it is only those experiences and those lessons which have made for soul growth that are immortalized by being registered in the real self. Only good is immortal. Evil is but transitory. The memory of a past life is often awakened by reading about or seeing the picture of some historical character. This arouses a consciousness of having lived at that time or in that place, or perhaps that the reader was himself the character mentioned. This is apt to give rise to ridicule, for many upon whom the memory of past lives is dawning seem never to have been anything but kings and queens or notable characters in history. There is a reason for this, for like most mistakes, it is rather a misunderstanding or misapplication of the remembrance than a deliberate attempt to deceive. It is a result of ignorance of the law. In such a case, the probability is that the person did live at the period remembered, and perhaps took a prominent part in the events enacted, but he was not necessarily the principal character. The feeling of peculiar sympathy or aversion that one feels in such a case is precisely what he felt at the time of the event. In the past, he may have been deeply interested in the characters under consideration and fond of imagining himself in their place. Thus, when the attention is turned to those old times, it awakens the old currents of feeling, and he thinks he actually was what in the past he had wished to be. Often there is another explanation. The noted personage may have stood out as the keynote of his time, and the circumstances that produced his eminence were lessons that many other souls learned. In fact, the leading character enacted the drama for all the lesser personalities belonging to the same group, and all learned the lesson through the one. For example, through the action of Abraham Lincoln, the whole nation learned that slavery should be and could be abolished, and the lesson was impressed more or less deeply on each soul according to its sympathy or activity in the matter. But only Abraham Lincoln actually freed the slaves. He could not have done this, however, without the aid of the thought force of the nation. He was the executor of the will of those who thought freedom. Every character in history had many persons who belonged to the same group, to the same nation, who were carried along in evolution by the same current, who learned by the failure or profited by the success of that character. As the soul at first remembers only the most important events, personages, and lessons impressed upon its consciousness, when that memory begins to be awakened, it is natural for it to think it was the central figure. There are hundreds who are sure they were Mary, Queen of Scots, hundreds who were Martin Luther, Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, and Helen of Troy. If they understood the law, however, it would be quite easy to determine whether or not they were the great personages whose names are given. A careful study of the character, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, will readily determine this. Study their mistakes and successes, and try to calculate what would be needed, according to the law of compensation, or karma, to overcome the mistakes or reap the rewards. Study their mentality and your own, and know well there is no retrogression. There are ups and downs that may seem like retrogression, but they are like the ups and downs of a gravity railway. The downs are always above the level of the starting point. A personage of historical prominence may at this time be incarnated in a very lowly station, but he will still have the same characteristics that made him great, and the important lesson learned in the prominent life will be indelibly impressed upon his present personality. If he were the central figure of the group, either for good or evil, he will always be a central figure. no matter in what walk of life he may incarnate. An Abraham Lincoln might incarnate as a plowboy, where conditions made education and culture almost impossible, but he would always have the ability of a Lincoln to master conditions. The general rule is that after one has cultivated his mental faculties and developed his brain to a high degree, he passes through an incarnation devoid of all chance for education. This is firstly to give him an opportunity to develop his heart qualities, and secondly to prove how much of the former culture he has really assimilated. No one can prove his character unless he is forced to depend on his real inner powers. Hence, no matter what the gain has been in the past, whether toward physical, intellectual, or spiritual perfection, he must of necessity pass through an incarnation where all outward helps toward the things attained are lacking, that he may prove himself. When one is told that in the past he was some great personage, it is wise to look up the history and customs of the time indicated and search for any glaring discrepancies between his own character and the character of the person under consideration. If discrepancies are found, they indicate error somewhere. For example, if a woman is told that she was an Egyptian priestess, a glance at history will show that the Egyptians admitted only women of high rank as priestesses, while there were many women attendants and nuns. The priestesses were specially trained to transmit the deepest mysteries. Hence, unless the person making the claim can prove that she possesses such powers today, she probably was merely an attendant, or perhaps a nun whose great ideal was to become a priestess. A woman who today possesses no independent psychic power could scarcely have been an Egyptian priestess, for such gifts, once gained, are never lost. Thus, an exceptional woman might have been an Egyptian priestess, but if so, she would today display the characteristics which enabled her to hold that high office. This will show how easily psychic messages can be confused and how absurd it makes one to repeat them without verifying them. While such discrepancies do not always mean that the one giving the information has misled him, yet under such circumstances, a careful investigation of the message and a consideration of its source is advisable. Absolute obedience to the higher guidance is required of all who would do the Master's work. But such guidance never violates common sense, and even the vow of obedience is never required until the pupil, through repeated experiences, has learned to have implicit faith in his guidance.